The moment the software crashed during the live demo, Ethan felt his stomach drop. The conference room fell silent, then erupted into chaos. The CEO of TechVision, along with several high-profile investors, stared at the screen in horror. A critical security breach warning flashed in bold red letters. This can't be happening," one of the board members stammered. Ethan knew exactly what had happened. The program had been flawless when he last checked it. Yet now, at the most crucial moment, it had collapsed in front of everyone. From across the table, Peter Whitman turned to him, feigning shock. "Ethan, I thought you assured us everything was ready?" His voice dripped with false concern, but Ethan could see the smugness in his eyes. Ethan clenched his fists under the table. This wasn't just an accident. He had been set up. TechVision had been working on this security software for over a year. It was supposed to be the company's golden ticket for their upcoming IPO. Ethan had led the technical side of the project from the beginning, ensuring every line of code was optimized, every vulnerability patched. But Peter? Peter had spent the last few months maneuvering himself into the spotlight, inserting himself into meetings Ethan had once led, making subtle but intentional changes to the project workflow. And now, just days before the software's official launch, it had failed in the most humiliating way possible. The CEO's face was stone cold. "Ethan, can you explain this?" Ethan took a deep breath, fighting to keep his voice steady. This wasn't supposed to happen. The security protocols were tested thoroughly. "There's no way." Peter cut him off with a heavy sigh. "Look, I don't want to jump to conclusions, but if Ethan says it was tested, and yet, here we are, with a catastrophic failure in front of our investors, then maybe, just maybe, there's been a lack of oversight." Ethan turned to him, his jaw tightening. "Lack of oversight?" Peter shrugged, leaning back in his chair as if this wasn't the biggest disaster of the company's history. "I hate to say it, but perhaps we've been too reliant on old methods." Old methods. Ethan knew exactly what Peter was implying. That he was outdated. That after 30 years in the industry, he had lost his edge. The investors started murmuring amongst themselves. Ethan could see doubt creeping into the CEO's expression. "Maybe we should table this discussion until we've had time to review what went wrong," Peter suggested. "I'll have my team analyze the code and see where the breakdown happened." "Your team?" Ethan nearly laughed. The same team Peter had been carefully positioning against him for months. The meeting ended in a blur. The last thing Ethan saw before leaving was Peter shaking hands with the CEO, whispering something in his ear. By the time Ethan reached his office, his hands were trembling. He closed the door behind him and exhaled sharply. He had given 15 years of his life to this company. Built its foundation, trained half of the engineers in the building, and ensured every major project was executed flawlessly. And now, he was being framed for its biggest failure. He reached for his personal laptop. If Peter thought he could bury him, he was wrong. Because Ethan wasn't going down without a fight. "Now, let me ask you, do you think Ethan was blindsided, or do you believe he had seen this coming all along? What would you do if you were in his position? Let me know in the comments below. Type 1 if you think Ethan should fight back immediately, or 5 if you think he should play it smart and gather more evidence. And if you love stories like this, don't forget to subscribe to EN True Tales for more incredible revenge and redemption stories. Stay tuned, because in the next part, Ethan is about to uncover a truth that will change everything. Ethan sat in his office, staring at the screen, his mind racing. He had seen power plays before, young, ambitious executives stepping on anyone in their way, but this? This was different. Peter had meticulously set the trap, waiting for the perfect moment to strike. Ethan took a deep breath and pulled up the system logs. If Peter had tampered with the software, there would be traces. Even the best cover-ups left fingerprints. He scrolled through the activity history, his fingers tightening on the mouse. Then, he saw it. A modification had been made to the security protocol just 2 hours before the demo, and it wasn't from his account. The change had weakened the firewall, allowing the system to crash under simulated cyberattack conditions. Ethan's heart pounded. Someone had deliberately inserted the flaw. And given the timing, there was only one person who could have orchestrated it. Peter. Ethan checked the author of the modification. The entry was labeled under a junior engineer's name, one of Peter's recent hires. A convenient scapegoat if things went south. He leaned back in his chair, his mind working rapidly. If he went straight to the board with this now, Peter would spin another story, twist the narrative in his favor. No, Ethan needed more. He needed undeniable proof. His fingers flew over the keyboard as he accessed the company's email archive. As a senior engineer, he had clearance to review project communications for security audits. If Peter had planned this, there would be emails, directives, something that tied him directly to the sabotage. And then, Ethan found it. An internal memo from Peter, sent weeks ago, instructing the engineering team to streamline security redundancies in preparation for the demo. The wording was vague enough to sound innocent but technical enough for Ethan to understand what it really meant: remove critical safety measures. Ethan's pulse quickened. He kept digging. More emails. More instructions. And then, the smoking gun. A message from Peter to the CEO, just a day before the demo. I have concerns that Ethan's outdated methods may slow us down. If something goes wrong during the presentation, I believe it will confirm that we need a fresh perspective in leadership. Ethan exhaled slowly, the anger settling into something calmer, more dangerous. Peter hadn't just set him up to fail. He had orchestrated an entire downfall, positioning himself to take over Ethan's role completely. But Peter had made one critical mistake. He had underestimated Ethan. Ethan wasn't going to sit back and watch his reputation crumble. He had spent years building Tech Vision into what it was, and he wasn't about to let a manipulative fraud destroy his legacy. He copied every relevant email, every suspicious modification log, every directive that pointed to Peter's deception. He backed up the files onto 3 separate encrypted drives, one of which he stored on a personal server outside of the company's network. Because if Peter was willing to sabotage a multi-million-dollar software demo, there was no telling how far he'd go to cover his tracks. And Ethan? Ethan was about to turn the game around. Ethan barely slept that night. His mind was racing, strategizing every possible move. He had the proof, but he couldn't afford to make a mistake. Peter had the CEO's trust, and the company's investors were on edge after the failed demo. If Ethan miscalculated, Peter would find a way to bury him completely. He needed to be smart, deliberate, and patient. The next morning, he walked into the office as if nothing had happened. Colleagues whispered as he passed, avoiding eye contact, their expressions a mix of sympathy and discomfort. The rumor mill had already spun into full force. As he reached his desk, his phone buzzed. An internal email from HR: meeting request, 2 p.m. Ethan smirked. Right on schedule. Peter wasn't wasting any time. A few hours later, Ethan stepped into the conference room. Sitting across from him were Peter and Diane from HR. The way Peter lounged back in his chair, arms folded, radiated smug confidence. Diane, on the other hand, looked hesitant, as if she knew something wasn't quite right but was powerless to change it. Ethan, Peter began, shaking his head with exaggerated disappointment. We need to talk about your performance. Ethan raised an eyebrow. My performance? Or the sabotage you orchestrated? Diane blinked, startled. Peter let out a forced chuckle. Come on, Ethan. Let's not be dramatic. The fact is, yesterday's failure has severely damaged the company's reputation. The board is looking for accountability. He slid a folder across the table. Ethan didn't bother opening it. He already knew what it contained: a carefully crafted performance review full of half-truths and manipulated data, just enough to justify pushing him out. We're offering you a generous severance package, Peter continued. But it comes with certain conditions. A non-disclosure agreement, for example. There it was. The final move. Peter wanted Ethan gone and silenced. Ethan leaned forward, clasping his hands together. "You know what's interesting, Peter?" he said calmly. "For a man who preaches efficiency, you sure are sloppy." Peter frowned. "Excuse me?" Ethan reached into his briefcase, pulled out a USB drive, and placed it on the table. "That drive contains every email, every system log, and every directive you gave instructing the team to remove security protocols." He tapped it lightly. "It also includes the modified firewall settings and a lovely little memo you sent to the CEO, conveniently blaming me for the failure before it even happened." Diane's eyes widened. Peter's smug expression flickered, just for a second. But Ethan caught it. "I was willing to let the board review this first," Ethan continued, "but since you're so eager to have this conversation now, I'd be happy to forward it all to them. I'm sure they'll be very interested in the fact that you deliberately sabotaged a project right before the company's IPO." Peter sat up straighter, his smile gone. "You have no proof of intent." Ethan chuckled. "You really think so? You gave your orders through email. You didn't think I'd check the system logs?" He shook his head. "Your arrogance is impressive." Diane finally spoke up, her voice uncertain. "Ethan, you're saying Peter engineered the failure?" "Absolutely." Ethan leaned back in his chair, enjoying the rare sight of Peter squirming. "Now, here's what's going to happen." Peter's jaw clenched. "You're going to retract this nonsense performance review. You're going to walk out of here, pretend this meeting never happened, and in return, I won't take this information straight to the board and the SEC." Diane gasped. Peter's knuckles turned white against the table. "The Securities and Exchange Commission." Ethan tilted his head. "That's right. IPO fraud is a big deal. If the investors find out you manipulated security testing results, they'll demand a full investigation." Peter's eyes darted toward Diane, then back to Ethan. His mind was spinning, calculating risks. Ethan smiled. "Or, if you prefer, we can proceed with your original plan and see how well your fresh perspective holds up in a courtroom." Silence filled the room. Peter inhaled sharply, forcing a smile that didn't reach his eyes. "We don't need to be hasty, Ethan. Perhaps we should revisit this conversation after some additional review." Ethan nodded slowly. "That's more like it." Peter stood abruptly, adjusting his suit. "I have another meeting to attend." "Of course you do," Ethan said, watching as Peter practically bolted from the room. Diane sat there, still stunned. "Is everything on that drive real?" Ethan met her gaze. "Every word." Diane swallowed, then nodded. I think I need to set up a meeting with the board." Ethan simply smiled. Checkmate. Ethan left the meeting room feeling something he hadn't felt in a long time, complete control. Peter had spent months orchestrating his downfall, and in just 15 minutes, Ethan had flipped the script. But this wasn't over. Peter wasn't the type to go down quietly. No, he would try to find a way to cover his tracks, twist the story, or, if he was truly desperate, eliminate Ethan as a threat altogether. Ethan needed to deliver the final blow before Peter had a chance to recover. Back in his office, he opened his email and composed a message directly to the board of directors. Subject: Urgent, Security Breach Investigation and IPO Risk. Dear board members, I have recently uncovered evidence that the security breach during our latest software demo was not an accident but a result of deliberate interference. This interference compromised the integrity of our project and, more importantly, the trust of our investors ahead of the company's IPO. I have compiled a full report detailing the unauthorized modifications, the individuals involved, and the communications instructing these changes. Given the legal and financial implications, I strongly urge an internal audit before any further steps are taken. The full documentation has been attached. Please let me know when we can discuss this matter further. Regards, Ethan Carter. He attached the files, emails, and security logs. Then, just for good measure, he forwarded a separate set of files to his personal attorney. If anything suspicious happened to him, if he were suddenly fired, locked out of the system, or accused of misconduct, his lawyer would ensure the documents were made public. Peter wouldn't know what hit him. Ethan barely had time to take a breath before his office phone rang. Ethan. The voice was CEO Richard Langley, a man who rarely got involved in department-level issues. I just received your email. This is concerning. Then I assume you'll be taking immediate action, Ethan said, keeping his voice measured. A pause. We need to review everything carefully. Ethan wasn't surprised. The board wouldn't want to admit they'd been played by Peter, not until they had no other choice. But Ethan had just forced their hand. I understand, he said. But be advised, Richard, if this isn't addressed internally, I have every intention of taking it to the SEC. Another long silence. We'll be in touch soon. Ethan hung up. It had begun. Less than an hour later, Peter stormed into Ethan's office, slamming the door behind him. His face was red with rage, his polished exterior cracking for the first time. You think you're clever, don't you? Peter hissed. You just made a massive mistake. Ethan leaned back in his chair, utterly unfazed. No, Peter. You made the mistake. You thought you could set me up and walk away unscathed. Peter sneered. You think Langley will side with you? You're outdated, Ethan. You're one bad PR scandal away from being completely irrelevant. Ethan tilted his head. And yet, here you are, panicking in my office. Peter exhaled sharply, gripping the back of a chair. You don't know who you're messing with. Oh, but I do, Ethan said coolly. You're a fraud. A manipulator. A man who thought he could outsmart experience. He leaned forward, voice calm but razor sharp. And now? You're finished. Peter's jaw clenched. His hands tightened into fists. You'll regret this, he spat before turning on his heel and storming out. Ethan simply smiled. No, Peter. You're the one who's going to regret it. By the next morning, word had spread like wildfire. TechVision had officially launched an internal compliance investigation. Every email, system log, and project directive related to the sabotaged demo was being reviewed. Peter's allies, the junior engineers he had manipulated, began to crack under pressure. Some admitted they had been pressured to alter the security protocols. Others revealed Peter had encouraged them to frame Ethan if things went wrong. By the end of the day, Peter was called into an emergency board meeting. Ethan wasn't invited. But he didn't need to be. He already knew exactly how this was going to end. By the time Peter walked into the emergency board meeting, the damage was already done. Ethan knew the moment the investigation started, it was only a matter of time before the truth surfaced. The board members were not fools, they had millions at stake with the upcoming IPO, and they wouldn't let one man's reckless ambition jeopardize their profits. Ethan remained at his desk, calm and collected, watching the office buzz with nervous energy. Word had spread quickly. People whispered in the hallways, some casting nervous glances toward Peter's office, while others, those who had been waiting for his downfall, exchanged knowing smirks. 2 hours passed before Ethan's phone rang again. It was Richard Langley. Ethan, I need you in my office. Now. The tone was clipped, professional, but not hostile. A good sign. Ethan walked to the CEO's office with measured steps. As soon as he entered, he saw Peter standing there, his face pale but still trying to mask his rage behind a forced expression of control. Richard was behind his desk, and 2 other board members sat stiffly, their eyes flicking between Ethan and Peter. Richard folded his hands together. We've reviewed the evidence. Ethan said nothing. He didn't need to. We found serious discrepancies in the project logs, Richard continued. It's clear that unauthorized changes were made to the security protocols without proper oversight. His gaze shifted to Peter, who clenched his jaw. I acted in the company's best interest, Peter insisted. We needed to meet the deadline, and Ethan was slowing us down. I made a judgment call. A judgment call? One of the board members scoffed. You falsified reports, tampered with the security framework, and deliberately allowed a critical failure to happen during a live demo. Do you have any idea what would have happened if we had launched the software in this condition? Peter opened his mouth but then shut it, realizing there was no way out. Richard exhaled sharply, rubbing his temple. We have no choice but to terminate your employment, effective immediately. Peter flinched, his face twisting with barely restrained fury. You're making a mistake. No, Peter, Richard said coldly. You made the mistake. A tense silence filled the room before Peter finally turned toward Ethan. This isn't over, he spat. You think you've won, but you're just another relic. The industry doesn't need people like you anymore. Ethan smiled, his eyes steady. Funny. That's what you said before the demo, wasn't it? Look where that got you. Security was called in to escort Peter from the building. As he passed through the office, a quiet hush settled over the employees. Some watched in disbelief. Others, including those Peter had mistreated, didn't bother hiding their satisfaction. Ethan returned to his desk and exhaled, the weight of the past few weeks finally lifting off his shoulders. He had won. But his work wasn't done. An email notification popped up on his screen. Subject: Urgent Opportunity. It was from a rival tech firm, one of TechVision's biggest competitors. Ethan, we heard about what happened. We'd like to meet. We believe your expertise is exactly what we need. Let's talk. Ethan chuckled to himself. It looked like his future was just getting started. Ethan sat back in his chair, staring at the email. A few weeks ago, the thought of leaving TechVision hadn't even crossed his mind. Now, everything had changed. He knew this offer wasn't just a coincidence. The industry moved fast, and word of Peter's downfall had undoubtedly spread like wildfire. Rival companies would see this as an opportunity to poach one of TechVision's top engineers, and honestly, he wasn't opposed to the idea. Still, before making any decisions, he needed to see what TechVision's next move would be. The next morning, Ethan was called into a private meeting with Richard Langley. Unlike the tense atmosphere of their previous conversations, this time, the CEO's expression was almost apologetic. Ethan, I won't waste your time, Richard started, leaning forward. We made a mistake. I made a mistake. Ethan remained silent, waiting. We should have seen what Peter was doing earlier, Richard continued. And we should have protected you instead of putting you in a position where you had to fight for your own reputation. He sighed. The board doesn't want to lose you. TechVision doesn't want to lose you. Ethan crossed his arms. What exactly are you saying? We're offering you full reinstatement, Richard said. Senior Engineering Director. A promotion, a pay increase, and full control over the security division. No interference from executives who don't understand the technology. Ethan had expected a counteroffer, but this was more than he anticipated. A promotion. More authority. A direct acknowledgement that they needed him. He considered it. But something inside him had already shifted. Let me ask you something, Richard, Ethan said. If Peter hadn't been exposed, would you have given me this offer? Or would I still be sitting in my office while the company quietly phased me out? Richard hesitated. That's what I thought, Ethan said. Richard's brows furrowed. Ethan, you've been with TechVision for 15 years. We don't want to lose someone of your caliber. Think about the impact you could make here, without Peter in the way. Ethan exhaled, looking around the office. The place he had poured his heart into. Then he thought about the email from the competitor. A fresh start. A place where his contributions would be valued from day one, not just when it was convenient. He looked back at Richard and made his decision. I appreciate the offer, Ethan said, standing up. But I think it's time for me to move on. Richard blinked, surprised. You're sure about this? Ethan nodded. For the first time in a long time, yes. As he walked out of the office for the last time, a wave of relief washed over him. This wasn't the end. It was a new beginning.